It was just another ordinary day in the small town of Cedar Ridge. Or so it seemed. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. But what happened next would shatter the calm and leave the entire town. And eventually, the world, in disbelief. It all began with a routine traffic stop. A black woman, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit, was pulled over by two police officers. The officers approached her car with the kind of confidence that comes from years on the job. But what they didn't know was that this encounter would soon spiral into something far beyond their understanding. As they asked for her license and registration, the woman remained calm, her eyes steady and her voice unwavering. But something about her demeanor seemed off. It wasn't fear or nervousness. It was something else. Something they couldn't quite put their finger on. The officers exchanged a glance, a smirk playing on their lips. They had seen it all before, or so they thought. They made a few offhand comments, chuckling to themselves as they ran her information through the system. But then, something strange happened. The computer froze. The screen flickered, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire system had crashed. The officers frowned, tapping the screen impatiently. "Must be a glitch," one of them muttered. But when they tried again, the same thing happened. And then, just as they were about to call it in, a message popped up on the screen. A message that would change everything. It was a directive from NASA, of all places, and it was addressed directly to them. The officers' laughter died in their throats as they read the words on the screen. Their eyes widened, and for the first time in their careers, they were at a complete loss for words. The woman in the car, meanwhile, sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. She didn't say a word, but there was a faint smile on her lips, as if she knew exactly what was happening. The officers turned to her, their earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of unease. "Who are you?" one of them finally managed to ask, his voice trembling slightly. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small, unassuming badge. She held it up for them to see, and as the sunlight caught the metallic surface, the officers' faces turned pale. It wasn't a driver's license or any kind of identification they had ever seen before. It was something else entirely. Something that defied explanation. Before they could react, a black SUV pulled up behind them, its windows tinted and its engine purring softly. Two men in suits stepped out, their expressions serious and their movements precise. They walked over to the car, ignoring the officers completely, and addressed the woman directly. "Dr. Evelyn Carter," one of them said, his voice low and respectful. "We've been expecting you." The officers looked at each other, their minds racing. Dr. Evelyn Carter? The name didn't mean anything to them, but the way these men spoke it, with a kind of reverence, sent a chill down their spines. Who was this woman? And why was NASA involved? As the men in suits escorted Dr. Carter to the SUV, one of the officers finally found his voice. "Wait!" he called out, his tone a mix of confusion and desperation. "What's going on here? Who is she?" The men in suits didn't answer. They simply opened the door for Dr. Carter, who gave the officers one last enigmatic smile before stepping inside. The SUV drove off, leaving the officers standing in the middle of the road, their minds reeling. They had no way of knowing that this was just the beginning, that the mystery of Dr. Evelyn Carter would soon explode into a full-blown scandal, one that would rock the town of Cedar Ridge to its core and capture the attention of the entire nation. But the real shock was yet to come. Days later, in a packed courtroom, the truth about Dr. Carter would finally be revealed. The officers, now sitting in the audience, watched in stunned silence as the prosecutor presented evidence that seemed to defy all logic. NASA had confirmed it. Dr. Evelyn Carter was not just any ordinary woman. She was something far more extraordinary, something that no one in that courtroom could have ever imagined. As the judge called for order and the room erupted into chaos, one question hung in the air. unanswered and terrifying. What did this mean for the rest of the world? The officers exchanged a glance, their earlier smugs replaced by a deep, unsettling fear. They had laughed at her, underestimated her, and now they were about to find out just how wrong they had been. But by then, it would already be too late. The courtroom was in chaos. Reporters scrambled to get closer to the front, their cameras flashing as they tried to capture every moment. Spectators whispered furiously to one another, their voices rising in a cacophony of disbelief and curiosity. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, but it was no use. The room was electric with tension, and no one could focus. All eyes were on Dr. Evelyn Carter, who sat calmly at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't flinch as the prosecutor held up a document stamped with the official NASA seal, his voice booming as he read, aloud. According to this report, Dr. Carter is not just a civilian. She is, in fact, a key figure in a classified project that has been under development for over a decade. A project that, until now, has been kept entirely secret from the public. The officers who had pulled her over that day shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had been subpoenaed to testify, but now they weren't sure what they were even doing there. They had thought it was just a routine traffic stop, a simple case of a broken taillight. But as the prosecutor continued, it became clear that nothing about this case was simple. Dr. Carter, he said, turning to face her, is one of the leading scientists behind Project Horizon, a groundbreaking initiative that has the potential to change the course of human history. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Project Horizon? What was that? And why had no one ever heard of it before? The prosecutor didn't offer any more details, but the implications were enough to send a ripple of unease through the courtroom. Dr. Carter's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Mitchell, stood up to object. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but firm, "this is highly irregular. My client's involvement in any government project is irrelevant to the charges at hand. This is nothing more than an attempt to sensationalize the case and distract from the facts." The judge nodded, but before he could rule, the prosecutor interjected. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is not just about a traffic stop. This is about national security. Dr. Carter's identity and her work are directly tied to the events that transpired that day. The public has a right to know." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He knew this case was unlike anything he had ever presided over. The stakes were higher than anyone realized, and the truth was far more complicated than it seemed. "I'll allow it," he said finally. "But tread carefully, counselor. This is a court of law, not a press conference." The prosecutor nodded, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. He turned back to the jury, his tone growing more intense. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know. Dr. Evelyn Carter is not just a scientist. She is a pioneer, a visionary, and, some might argue, a threat." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. Dr. Carter remained silent, her expression unreadable. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't about to let the prosecutor's theatrics go unchallenged. "Your Honor," she said, rising to her feet again, "I move to dismiss this case entirely. The prosecution has failed to present any evidence linking my client to the alleged charges. Instead, they're using this platform to spread fear and speculation. This is a blatant abuse of the judicial process." The judge considered her words, his brow furrowed in thought. He knew she had a point, but he also knew that this case was bigger than just a traffic stop. There was something else at play here, something that went far beyond the confines of the courtroom. As the arguments continued, the officers who had pulled Dr. Carter over that day couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. They had thought they were just doing their jobs, but now they were caught in the middle of something they didn't understand. One of them, Officer Mark Harris, leaned over to his partner, Officer Lisa Ramirez, and whispered, "What the hell? did we get ourselves into? Lisa shook her head, her eyes fixed on Dr. Carter. I don't know, she murmured. But I have a feeling this is just the beginning. Outside the courtroom, the town of Cedar Ridge was buzzing with rumors. News of the case had spread like wildfire, and everyone had an opinion. Some people believed Dr. Carter was a hero, a brilliant mind working to advance humanity. Others thought she was a danger, someone whose work could have catastrophic consequences. And then there were those who didn't know what to think. They just knew that something big was happening, something that would change their lives forever. Back inside the courtroom, the prosecutor was laying out his case, piece by piece. He presented documents, photographs, and even a video clip from a NASA press conference that had been held years earlier. In the clip, a younger Dr. Carter stood at a podium, her voice confident as she spoke about the future of space exploration. "We are on the brink of a new era," she said, her eyes shining with passion. "An era in which the boundaries of what we think is possible will be pushed further than ever before." The video ended, and the prosecutor turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is the woman sitting before you today. A woman who has dedicated her life to pushing the boundaries of science and technology. But at what cost? What is she hiding? And why was she in Cedar Ridge that day?" The questions lingered, unanswered, as the courtroom erupted into murmurs once again. Sarah Mitchell stood up, ready to counter the prosecutor's claims. But before she could speak, the judge called for a recess. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour," he said, slamming his gavel. As the room began to empty, Dr. Carter remained, seated, her gaze fixed on some distant point. She knew the truth, of course. She had always known, but revealing it now, in this setting, could have consequences far beyond what anyone in that courtroom could imagine. As the officers filed out, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were caught in the middle of something much larger than themselves. Mark turned to Lisa, his voice low. "Do you think she's really a threat?" he asked. Lisa hesitated, her mind racing. "I don't know," she said finally. "But one thing's for sure. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." And as they stepped out into the bright sunlight, they couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. But would it bring clarity or chaos? Only time would tell. As the courtroom emptied for the recess, the tension didn't dissipate. It only grew thicker, like a storm gathering. On the horizon, Dr. Evelyn Carter remained seated, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around her. Her lawyer, Sarah Mitchell, leaned in close, her voice low but urgent. "Evelyn," she said, "we need to talk. This is spiraling out of control. If there's something you're not telling me, now's the time." Dr. Carter met her gaze, her eyes steady but unreadable. "Sarah," she said softly, "there are things I can't explain. Not yet. But trust me when I say this is bigger than you realize." Sarah exhaled sharply, frustration and concern warring on her face. She had taken this case because she believed in justice. But now she was starting to wonder if justice was even possible in a situation like this. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the town of Cedar Ridge was in a frenzy. News vans lined the streets, their satellite antennas reaching toward the sky like silent sentinels. Reporters shouted questions at anyone who walked by, hoping for a soundbite or a glimpse of the mysterious Dr. Carter. Local residents gathered in small clusters, their voices hushed but animated as they speculated about what was really going on. "Did you hear?" One woman whispered to her friend. "They're saying she's some kind of spy. Or maybe a whistleblower. Either way, this is huge." Her friend nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "I heard she's working on something that could change the world. Something the government doesn't want us to know about." Back inside the courthouse, Officer Mark Harris and Officer Lisa Ramirez found themselves in a quiet hallway, away from the prying eyes of the media. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his face pale and drawn. "Lisa," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What if we messed up? What if we were wrong about her? Lisa crossed her arms, her expression troubled. We were just doing our jobs, she said, but there was a note of uncertainty in her voice. But, I don't know. Something about this whole thing doesn't feel right. Did you see the way those NASA guys looked at her? Like she was, I don't know, important. Too important for this. Mark nodded, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of Dr. Carter's badge. The way it had gleamed in the sunlight. It wasn't like anything he'd ever seen before. What do you think Project Horizon is? He asked finally. Lisa shook her head. I have no idea. But whatever it is, it's got people scared. And that's never a good sign. As the recess dragged on, the prosecutor, a man named Robert Grayson, huddled with his team in a small conference room. Maps, documents, and photographs were spread out across the table, each one adding another layer to the mystery. We need to tread carefully, Robert said, his voice tight with tension. If we push too hard, we risk exposing things that are better left hidden. But if we don't push hard enough, she walks. And we can't let that happen. One of his assistants, a young woman named Emily, frowned as she studied a photograph of Dr. Carter at a NASA facility. Do you really think she's a threat? She asked. Robert hesitated, his jaw tightening. I don't know, he admitted. But what I do know is that she's at the center of something big. Something that could change everything. And until we know what that is, we can't afford to take any chances. Across town, in a dimly lit diner, a man in a dark suit sat alone in a corner booth. He sipped his coffee slowly, his eyes fixed on the small TV mounted above the counter. The news was playing footage from the courthouse, and the man's expression was unreadable as he watched Dr. Carter being escorted inside. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number, his voice low and measured. It's me, he said. Things are moving faster than we anticipated. We need to be ready. There was a pause as the person on the other end responded. And then, the man nodded. Understood. I'll keep you updated. He hung up and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his eyes never leaving the TV screen. Back at the courthouse, the recess was coming to an end. Sarah Mitchell took a deep breath as she prepared to face the prosecutor again. She knew this wasn't just about defending her client anymore. It was about uncovering the truth, no matter how dangerous that truth might be. Evelyn, she said, turning to Dr. Carter one last time. If there's anything you can tell me, anything at all, now's the time. Dr. Carter hesitated, her gaze distant. Sarah, she said finally, there are forces at play here that even I don't fully understand, but I can tell you this. What's happening in that courtroom is just the beginning. The real battle is still to come. As the judge called the court back to order, the tension in the room was palpable. The prosecutor stood, his expression grim, as he prepared to continue his case. But before he could speak, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. A man burst through the doors, his face flushed and his breathing ragged. Your Honor, he shouted, holding up a piece of paper. I have new evidence. Evidence that changes everything. The room erupted into chaos as the bailiffs rushed to restrain the man. But he waved the paper frantically, his eyes wild. This isn't just about Dr. Carter, he cried. This is about all of us. About the future of humanity. The judge slammed his gavel, his voice booming over the noise. Order, order in the court. But it was no use. The man's words had struck a chord, and the room was in an uproar. Dr. Carter sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, but her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She knew what was coming next, and she knew it would change everything. But for now, all she could do was wait, and hope that the truth, when it finally came to light, would be enough to save them all.